Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.
Good evening and welcome to Louisiana Public Square. I'm Carl Redman, former executive editor of the Advocate newspaper, now retired. Summer has turned to fall, and you know what that means. No, not sweaters. It means you won't be able to channel surf on weekends without landing on big-time college football games, live or in replays. Coast to coast, America is obsessed with college football. And it's not just the big teams in prime time. Small colleges across the nation and across Louisiana field teams that are the centerpieces of their athletic programs and attract thousands to their stadiums. College athletic programs around the country generate more than $11 billion in annual revenue. So how big a business are college sports in Louisiana? Should student athletes get paid for their efforts? And will a recent NCAA ruling further widen the wealth gap between the state's athletic program? Louisiana Public Square looks for answers tonight as we explore Varsity, Inc., the business of college sports.
When it comes to the business of college sports in Louisiana, LSU ranks in the Fortune 500.
Statewide, the amount of money that is brought into the state because of the existence of the LSU football games alone is almost $100 million that's spent at hotels and restaurants over a 7-game season.
Lauren Scott, professor emeritus of economics at LSU, has studied the economic impact of LSU sports 3 times. His most recent study analyzed the program's revenues for 2012.
They bring in money from basically what I call 2 different sources. One is the general operations of the athletic programs there, which is about almost $100 million. And then there's another almost $60 million that comes in from the Tiger Athletic Foundation.
The LSU athletic department not only pays for itself, but actually gave $7.2 million back to the university in 2013. But Louisiana's 10 other NCAA Division I sports programs all receive financial support from taxpayers to stay afloat. Louisiana Tech relies on more than $31,000 per athlete in subsidies. The ULL Ragin' Cajuns depend on $20,000 per player, and Southern University more than $14,000 per student athlete. But Southern's athletic director, William Broussard, says that subsidies from the university have decreased in the past 2 years, making the program one of the leanest in its conference and the state.
Across the Southwestern Athletic Conference, those institutions' athletic departments are supported in between 70 and 85%. By the university, and across the state of Louisiana, the average is about 65%. So for us to be in between 40 and 45% means that this athletic program relies substantially less on the university for subsidy and much, much more on corporate sponsorships, private donations, and ticket sales.
The economic disparity between universities in the Southeastern Conference, like LSU, and those in the 4 other NCAA conferences represented in Louisiana is likely to get even wider after a recent ruling. The governing body of collegiate athletics voted last month to allow more autonomy to its 5 biggest conferences, including the SEC.
And what that's going to allow is really enable those conferences to create legislation, to adopt legislation that is going to provide them the ability to utilize the resources that they have within their institutions to really create more benefits for student athletes.
Kathy Keene is Chief Operating Officer of the Sun Belt Conference, whose members include ULL and ULM. Keene says one issue the larger conferences will be looking at is increasing the amount that athletic scholarships cover, something the NCAA currently restricts.
When you're in a full scholarship, it basically is considered a full grant aid, and that does cover room, board, tuition, all of the main things that we think of when we think of just expenses for an institution. But there is an additional number called cost of attendance that really is the gap between a full grant aid, a full ride, so to speak, and what it costs to attend that school.
According to the National College Players Association, the average out-of-pocket shortfall for each full scholarship in 2010 was more than $3,200 per player. Universities outside of the Big Five conferences wanting to stay competitive can opt into the proposed changes, but faced increased operating costs if they do. Broussard is worried about what the ruling will mean for his university's ability to recruit.
So if they're able to offer cost of attendance, if they're able to offer unlimited meals, and institutions at the mid-major level, even in the state of Louisiana, not LSU, but ULL, Louisiana Tech, Tulane, where historically Southern University has competed against those institutions for recruits, that gets more challenging along the lines if that legislation changes.
Another big issue on the horizon that could affect all university sports budgets is the August ruling in O'Bannon versus the NCAA. The case was filed by former UCLA basketball player Ed O'Bannon, seeking compensation for student athletes when their likeness is used in video games and television broadcasts. The federal judge ruled in O'Bannon's favor.
That part of the ruling says that the NCAA and the schools themselves have to be allowed to put some money in a trust for the student athletes that the student athletes can have access to after they graduate or after they exhaust their eligibility. And that trust is supposed to be money that the schools derive from video games and television broadcasts.
Gabe Feldman is the director of the sports law program at Tulane. He says the O'Bannon case represents a growing movement by student athletes to gain a seat at the table in the college sports boardroom, reflected also by the request of Northwestern University's football team to unionize.
Right now, student athletes don't have much of a voice, don't have much of a say in how they're treated. They take their scholarship, they take the rules, and they either accept them or they don't get to play. And so what the Northwestern unionization case was about was the members of the Northwestern football team petitioning to the National Labor Relations Board saying, we are employees. We are employees in everything but name. And we should be recognized as employees, and if we're recognized as employees, we then have a right to bargain collectively with Northwestern.
If you want to excel as an athlete, you got to put extra time in before practice, time in after practice. Obviously, your practice time, you could go to the training room. There's a lot that's involved in that process. And when you put that along with being in 5 or 6 classes, your sport is, for all intents and purposes, a full-time job.
Collis Temple III was a basketball player for LSU and a professional player with the Detroit Pistons. While he says he doesn't have the solution, he fully supports providing some form of compensation to student athletes, especially for the cash-strapped standouts that are bringing in fortunes to their universities.
Everybody has horses. You know, these coaches are looking for thoroughbreds. And so when they find one, but the thoroughbred can't eat, you got to look at different ways to compensate in some capacity the guys that are making it happen.
Well, making it happen in our studio audience tonight are residents from the greater Baton Rouge area. They include university students, high school members of the Legislative Youth Advisory Council, a sports agent and former athletic director and conference commissioner. Welcome, everyone. LSU's Public Policy Research Lab surveyed over 100 citizens on tonight's topic. Here's a look at some of the responses. When asked if the athletic programs of colleges in major Division I conferences like the Southeastern Conference have an unfair advantage over schools in smaller conferences, 60% of respondents said yes, while 32% said no. 8% were unsure. When those surveyed were asked if they think that college sports are more like amateur or professional sports, 72% said more like professional sports, while 21% said more like amateur sports. The remaining 7% were unsure. When a college or company sells a jersey with a college athlete's number on it or sells a video game with a player's likeness in it, 49% of respondents think that the player should receive some money from the sales. But 45% said that should not be allowed. 6% were unsure. When asked their support for allowing college athletes to form a union to negotiate their rights and working conditions, 57% of those surveyed opposed this idea, while 41% support it. 2% were unsure. Let's start there. Considering the business that college sports has become, should student athletes be treated like employees of their university? Should they be paid? Cheryl.
Well, currently you have superstars on various teams. especially in the Big Five. And our Big Five in Louisiana would include LSU. And then the smaller leagues, Sunbelt, SWAC, you have some superstars there. And so when they get the national recognition, the local recognition, and they're not getting full scholarship, beyond the board, the meals, the tuition, and the books, that $3,200 that was mentioned earlier in the video, I think some compensation is justified.
Well, how are they going to come up with the money to do that, particularly the small schools?
Well, if the small schools are getting corporate sponsorship, there should be some increment, some percentage. If they're getting corporate sponsorship, there should be a small percentage, even if it's just an amount to give the player something for using his name or his number for the popularity of the institution.
Word, what do you think? Should athletes be paid?
Well, treated like an employee, no. I don't believe they're employed. They're student athletes first. They're students first to get their profession. In many instances, they're not going to be professionals whenever they get older in sports. So they're going to seek other professions. Right now, they're there to have fun and they're to get their education for their job. For right now, I believe that while there should be some benefits as they do have right now, I believe that they shouldn't necessarily get paid. But for expenses like medical coverage and stuff like that, whenever they get hurt, I do believe they should have things like that. But for just plainly getting paid for playing a sport that really is a privilege to play in, I don't believe so.
Well, in Louisiana, LSU is the only athletic program that pays for itself. All the rest of the athletic programs depend on state subsidies, student fees, and donations. Sheldon, if they're going to pay student athletes, isn't that going to bump up either the tuition or student or state subsidies?
Absolutely. I'm a product of Grambling State University, and everyone knows what Grambling struggled with last year. Grambling had a financial hardship trying to keep the lights on and different things at Grambling. So I don't see how they're going to raise the funds when they can barely fund a football program.
Just a quick snapshot going back to September the 7th. That's a Saturday. That's the first Saturday in this football season. LSU plays Sam Houston, win 56-0. Arkansas plays Nicholls State. They win 73-7. Baylor plays Northwestern from Natchez. Baylor wins 70-6. Those contests are out there for the smaller schools to make money, but is that fair to the fans? Is it fair to the schools? Is it fair to the athletes? Don, I think you might have some special insights into this.
Well, fortunately, when I was an athletic director at that level, we didn't have to play. We didn't play the money games, as they say. In reality, nowadays, they have to do it to survive. They're playing from anywhere from $500,000 to almost $1 million to play on the road. Now, there's an exception. McNeese should have beaten Nebraska a week or so ago. But the other scores you mentioned are more the reality.
You have some expertise in this. Could you tell our viewers what your background is a little?
Well, I've been an athletic director at Nicholls State University, a commissioner of the Southland Conference, and a commissioner of the Sunshine State Conference, a Division II conference in Florida.
And you didn't have to schedule those or you didn't have the opportunity, or?
Well, one, they weren't playing us then, so we didn't have the opportunity. Second, I'm concerned about that. Maybe it's a thrill for those kids to go on the road and play in these big stadiums. But when you're getting beat over 60 points or more, that's not too good for their morale. And I'm always worried about injuries. Injuries could affect the kids individually as well as the rest of the team's schedule. So I personally, I understand why they have to do it. I wish they didn't have to do it to meet their budgets.
Well, the Power Five, I think is what they're calling it, decision by the NCAA to allow the big conferences to start putting out more money is going to skew the differences between the big schools and the small schools even more. So, Drew, do you think that that's going to prompt more of these games, or do you think there'll be some winnowing out to where they tier themselves?
Well, the way I see it, I've got a background from a non-revenue generating sport at a major D1 university. So where my concern lies is non-revenue generating sports. Now, where you're talking about...
Which sport?
Swimming and diving. So when you're talking about this difference, there already is a large difference in terms of recruiting. If you're looking at going to a major D1 institution, you're looking at a select schools already. And now that you're talking about separating these divisions, you're talking about Power 5 versus non-Power 5, and you're talking about taking away these games, I look at it as if I were at a level where I'd be looking at some of the smaller, lower division schools, maybe D1 AA schools, and you take those games away where we aren't getting that money back. Sure, the score's a little offside, but it's a two-way street. The school's entering it for getting the $800,000 or whatever amount it is, the $500 to $1 million. If you're taking that amount of money away from my budget to be a premier athlete of that school, I'm a little concerned regardless of whether the result's going to be.
Stoney, do you think that there may be a push, or do you think they ought to limit the number of athletic programs that can go big time, especially a state like Louisiana?
I feel like they shouldn't limit it. I think that football brings in stuff for Louisiana just as baseball, and I feel like gymnastics and swimming and stuff like that brings in just as much revenue. Doesn't bring in just as much, but it does bring in revenue.
Well, in the big schools, these premier athletes, Cheryl, you were talking about the superstars. They have access to a lot of glitz and glamour. Should they be held to a higher standard? Tommy, what do you think?
I do think so. I mean, they represent the school and they know what they signed up for when they accepted the scholarship. Going backwards, I don't think they should be compensated like an employee, but all living expenses should be increased. You don't want to hear about an athlete who's having a hard time eating on the weekend. But as a representative of the university and accepting the scholarship, I think you know what you're getting into and should be held to a higher standard as a result.
Cheryl, yes.
One of the things that the research says that you sent was that some of the athletes on scholarship who live off campus are living below poverty level, and that should not be. I mean, they have their studies. That's the number one priority. We agree with that. But then if you're having to practice, study, and then you don't have enough food to eat, that should be a reason to have some sort of stipend, not a salary, but a stipend.
But they're getting tuition paid. Most of them are getting room and board. They may not have enough to pay for the entire of their college career. They can't pay necessarily for...
They don't have time to get an extra job.
A lot of other students are in the same boat, though.
But these are your athletes that are playing football or basketball, but we're talking football. So they have practice, they have away games. That's a lot of time. And then they have to be tutored in between so they can keep the GPA to stay on the team and be eligible.
Sheldon.
I think we're sending a dangerous message when we start to pay student athletes. What's the primary goal for going to college? Are we going to college to get an education, or are we going to college to play sports? Because if we start to compensate these students on an astronomical level, colleges like Grambling and Southern, who barely have enough money to do operating expenses, they're not going to be able to afford that. And what's going to happen to those universities? I think that's an important point to make.
Well, there's been some indication from some student athletes that if they got paid, they would stay beyond, or they stay far enough to graduate instead of jumping to the pros for some of the superstars. Do you think that might be an impact there?
I think it could make an impact. I mean, obviously, recently, just with LSU, you start to see that these players that are leaving for the pros early have potentially had an impact on the field success. However, I'm more in the position that even, yes, there's maybe some athletes that are living below poverty levels. I think you have regular academic students that hold down jobs at a university. They work essentially full time with their classes and with their jobs on campus. That they're also living below poverty level, and they also have to pay their tuition and for their food and their room and board. And I'm not necessarily seeing that. I don't necessarily see the fairness in saying that they should also get even more than what they're already getting paid for. So.
Well, that's all the time we have for this portion of our show. When we return, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to further discuss the business of college sports. Welcome back to Louisiana Public Square. Tonight we're looking at the business of college sports in the state. Joining us now is our panel of experts. Carl Benson is the commissioner of the Sun Belt Conference. a position he has held since February of 2012. Under his tenure, the conference has added 5 additional all-sports members to the league. Mr. Benson was formerly commissioner of the Western Athletic Conference. Joe Alleva is the Vice Chancellor and Director of Athletics at LSU. Now in his 7th year at the college, Alleva previously was the Athletic Director at Duke University. He has served on committees for the Southeastern Conference, Atlantic Coast Conference, and NCAA. Roger Cador is entering his 30th season as baseball coach for Southern University. Among his many accomplishments are 14 Southwestern Athletic Conference championships and Coach of the Year awards. A former student athlete himself, Coach Cador played professionally for the Atlanta Braves. Gabe Feldman is director of the sports law program at Tulane University. Professor Feldman acts as a consultant for a number of clients in the sports industry and is frequently featured in the national media providing sports law analysis. Before we go to our audience for questions, if you could each tell us very briefly from your individual perspective, is the growing commercialization good or bad for college sports? And Commissioner Benson, we'll start with you.
Well, I think for many years, since the advent of television, sports has been commercialized. And obviously in the last several years, it's escalated. And I think that with all the publicity and the national attention, it's brought us to this conversation tonight. So is it too much? I don't know if you can ever say whether it's too much or too less.
Joe Alleva?
Well, I agree with Carl that the commercialization that we are experiencing right now is not really a new phenomenon. It's been in existence for at least a decade, and I think if you asked athletes, they would say that it's not a bad thing. I think they enjoy having their likeness on television and having their fans and their friends and their families see them on TV. So I really don't think it's a bad thing.
Coach Cador.
Well, we live in a world where people want to be seen on TV, and the fans love it, the players love it, as Joe mentioned, and they want to be seen on TV, and parents want to see, and the families want to see their relative play on TV so they can have that gathering together if it's on a weekend for football. So it's a big thing. So it serves a great purpose, and so we're just going to see what happens in the future.
Professor Feldman?
I think like most things, there's some good and some bad about it. I think the commercialization, some positive effects, as these folks have already talked about. I think college sports is now much more responsive to consumer demand. I think if you looked at college sports on television in the 60s and 70s, you couldn't turn on your television and watch every game, any game you wanted to. Now you can. Literally can watch any game you want. I think that's a positive for fans. I think that college athletes are getting great exposure. I think they get great opportunities. So that's a lot of good. There's some potential for bad. The potential is for bad is if the commercialization leads the schools to make decisions that put sports forward and put sports first and education second. And that happens, I think we can see in certain circumstances, not in all circumstances, but to the extent there's a temptation to do that because of commercialization, there's a potential for bad.
Crystal, do you have a question for our panel?
Yes, I do. Giving these additional incentives to these student athletes, do you not feel that it's going to put more of a gap between the D1 universities and colleges, and you have the other students like the HBCUs and things like that, where it's more of a Division I here and SBCUs here? The students are getting so much of a financial boost by going to, say, LSU versus Southern University. Academically, we want to make sure that our universities are placing our students in that aspect. You want to make sure that academics lead, not sports. Being that we're having to have this conversation in regards to whether or not athletes should be compensated for playing football, baseball, and as you're speaking of swim teams, diving and things of that nature, isn't it putting more aspects as far as on athletics, placing money into their pockets? Then it feels to me that the educational system is going into like a financial shift. We're putting sports before education, and I don't feel that.
Yeah, I think I'd like to hear what Coach Cador has to say about this, because this whole idea of skewing between the rich schools and the small and the big schools is something that I think is very important to the whole conversation.
Well, it exists. I've lived that life for 30-some years, so it exists, and we have to live with it. There are enough Skip Birkin and I are good friends, and when we started playing each other, he said Baton Rouge was big enough where Southern and LSU could coexist. Well, the top schools are going to be what they are, and there are a lot of opportunities in the other arena if you understand your situation and work toward it. That's basically how you have to look at it. Don't complain. Go out and work hard and do the best you can with what's out there. There are a lot of gyms out there. You have to find them and make the very best out of your situation, because that's the only way you can change it.
Commissioner Benson, you're from a smaller conference.
The athletic scholarship has been in existence for decades, and it's allowed student athletes in all sports to gain some financial assistance to go to college. So in my mind, it's not compensation, it's not pay for play. It's been in existence just like music scholarships and theater scholarships and academic scholarships. For the past 25 years, the athletic scholarship has remained totally stagnant. There's been no increase. And we have been probably neglectful in acknowledging, the state of economics. And I think all we're trying to do right now is to create a new scholarship model that allows for greater benefits, not compensation, not pay, but to allow that cost of attendance gap to be narrowed and to shrink. We also have been neglectful in promoting the number of student athletes who are already receiving full cost of attendance through national, federal financial aid. And there are student athletes on Joe's campus, on campuses at SWAC schools, at campuses on Sunbelt schools that are already receiving kind of the maximum that is allowable. So we're just, it's something that we should have done many, many years ago.
But if the schools have to come up with more money, isn't that going to put the smaller schools at a disadvantage?
Well, there's always been that economic gap, and there'll always be that economic gap. And a good example that I often try to use is, the difference between University of Louisiana at Lafayette and LSU, that gap has always been there.
But doesn't that then create a different talent pool for the two?
Well, I think it depends on sport. I think it depends on the sport. So.
You're shaking your head, Joe.
Well, I think that there's a gap now. I think there's been a gap forever. And I don't think that any stipends that athletes are allowed to get is going to change that gap. There's only so many scholarships, I'll use football, that we can give for players at LSU. And when those scholarships are used up, all the rest of the players in the state have to go somewhere else. And that's the case now. That's going to always be the case. So I don't really think it's not going to change recruiting one bit. If we go after a kid and recruit them at LSU, the odds are most of the time we're going to get that kid, or we have a really good chance of getting that kid when I'm competing against other schools in the state. Now, when we're all finished with our scholarships, we only have 25 we can give a year. When we're finished with our 25, the rest of the athletes, football players in the state have to go somewhere else. And that's the case now, and it will be the case forever.
But if your scholarship is worth more than his scholarship, isn't that going to make yours that much more attractive?
My argument is that mine may be more attractive right now.
And that's absolutely the case. That on the other hand, in some of the other sports, whether it's the swimming and divings or even baseball to some extent, UL Lafayette, can and has competed against LSU on the baseball side. So there may be, depending on the sport, there may be some advantage, disadvantage that ends up occurring when those that have the resources have greater opportunities to provide.
And a big reason for that is, like in a sport like baseball, there are very few full scholarships. Coach here will tell you. Yeah. So you have to divide your scholarships up, which creates a bigger pool to spread out and makes it more equitable for everybody.
I think you're getting into Caitlin's concern about how this would work. Caitlin, you want to?
My question was, if we start paying the student athletes, how would you determine how much to pay them? Would the higher profile athletes, should they receive more? I think anyone that's been on LSU's campus can see that Patrick Peterson, Tyrann Mathieu have obviously helped the number 7 jersey become a huge deal on LSU's campus. So should these higher profile athletes receive more for their likeness when they're obviously generating a lot more revenue for certain universities than other players?
Can I say something? Back in 1971, when I was in college, Joe was in college, we got $15 a month for laundry. That's what they call it back then?
It's laundry money.
Laundry money. They were paying us way back then. And I think had the NCAA really stayed with it and increased it as we went along, we wouldn't have this conversation right now. I think they missed the boat by not taking advantage of that. Now we've got this big mess on how to, you can't pay the high profile athlete any more than the next kid. Because even at your school, it can't work. It wouldn't work. You create problems.
Well, let me just say one other thing. Let's not forget that 95% of the schools in this country, athletic departments, lose money. Lose money. They're subsidized by the university to have an athletic program. I'm very fortunate to be at LSU where we give money back to the university. We're one of the few schools in the whole country that do that. So all the 95% of the rest of the schools are losing money, and we're just talking about football or basketball players. You got to give the same amount of money to women. You're going to have to give the same amount of money to women. So you're talking about a huge amount of money when you really start looking at it.
I'd like to hear Professor Feldman talk a little bit about what the technical details are in the O'Bannon ruling, how that might play out, because I think some of what Joe's saying, it's a little Greek to me. I don't know all the details.
Well, even before we get into O'Bannon for a second, just to get to Caitlin's question about how much would you pay the different athletes and would you pay the star players more, I think it just depends on your perspective. And for decades, we've seen college football and college sports is unique, and it can't operate in a free market system, and you're starting to get pushback on that. And the pushback is, why can't it? Why can't we allow the schools to make individual decisions about what they will pay their student athletes? And the LSUs will pay more than the University of Louisiana Lafayette's, and they'll continue to get the better players. The only thing that'll change is that the student athletes will get some of that money instead of it all flowing into other areas. But in terms of why can't you pay the top player more than the backup offensive lineman, I don't know the answer why you can't do that. Now, it might be logistically difficult, but that's how it works in every other free market system. That's how it works in the National Football League, where the star quarterback makes a lot more than the backup offensive lineman. It seems to work fine for them. There don't seem to be any issues on the team about disparity in pay affecting camaraderie and the dynamics of the team. So it's a totally different system, and I understand that. And it may not work for budgetary reasons. The schools may not have the money to pay the athletes at all. And as Joe mentions, and it's a great point, I think it gets lost a lot, you have Title IX implications. If you're going to pay the men, federal law requires to some extent that you pay the women, whether it's exactly equal or somewhat equal. So if you're paying $500,000 to the men, you have to find $500,000 for the women. Now, that could be a boon for women's sports because all of a sudden, if the men demand the payment and the market dictates it, then the women are going to get some of it too. The O'Bannon case is very different because the O'Bannon lawsuit involved former players and now current players saying, you're using our name, image, and likeness to make money in video games and, more important than that, in television broadcasts. And they say the reason you're getting these $100 million, billion-dollar contracts is because we're on the field, we're on the court. People are paying to see us play. Now, is there some value derived from the colleges and the NCAA? Obviously. Is there some value derived from the players themselves? Yes. I think it's hard to deny that. And so what a federal court said, and this was a change in how the courts have looked at this over the last century really, is that not forcing the schools to do anything, but saying the NCAA as a group of institutions can come together and say, we refuse to pay you anything for the use of your name, image, and likeness. Now, it's very specific what the ruling says with respect to video games and television. The schools can agree not to put any money in a trust fund to be used after they graduate. Right? They have to be allowed to put some in if they want to, but the NCAA can put a cap on how much they get, but that cap can't be lower than $5,000. So it's a very sort of complicated, specific ruling, and nobody really knows what it means and how it's going to work going forward. The schools don't know what to do with it. I mean, you can tell me if you think differently. And we're really just waiting for the Court of Appeals to step in, because what's strange about the ruling is the federal judge said the schools can't get together and say you can't pay the athletes zero for their name, image, and likeness, but you can't get together and agree that they only get $5,000 for name, image, and likeness. So she's replacing what could be one antitrust violation with her own judicially sanctioned antitrust violation. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. It's going to be up to the conferences to decide. What we know now is the NCAA itself can't say you can't pay them anything. And again, by pay, they're not getting it paid when they're in school. This is going to be put in a trust for them to be used after they graduate.
William, you got a question?
Yeah, I mean, we're all talking about money, but at the end of the day, when you go to college, you go for education. Like I say, first of all, it's a student athlete. I mean, everybody wants to get paid, but chances are out of the people that want to get paid, there's 1,000 athletes, and like I say, you can't pay everybody. I mean, some schools, they just don't have it, but if you go to school for education,
you have a lot of good players that passed up on, LSU. Some went to ULM, some went to Southern. They went for an education and for a purpose, and that's, at the end of the day, that's your main purpose. You can make money after you get out of college. We're not talking about, you're at a Walmart or a Costco and then you're in college, and that's what it's for. It's there to teach you to get ready for life. And if you can't deal with hardships in college, that's not going to help you when you get out in the world. If you think that everything you do that you got to be compensated for, yes, you make billions of dollars, Sylvia Fowles, Shaq, their likenesses are everywhere. But like I said, you're in college. They wanted to do better. They wanted to make more money. They went to the pros. You got a lot of people that have played 4 years as a starter, and they don't want to go to the pros, They want to go be doctors. They want to go be lawyers. And, you can't do nothing but respect that. But if you go to college thinking that you're going to get paid, you need to just go ahead and skip it and try to go to the pros, and that's how I feel about it. I mean, money is always going to be there, but if I got to pay you to come to my college and play, I don't need you on my team. Like I say, one person or one situation is not bigger than the whole team and what the whole goal is.
Commissioner Benson, you've got some smaller schools, and you're
well, a couple points. I think that we really have to separate the value of the scholarship versus the image and the potential revenue that comes with that, and that's the pay for play. The scholarship has, again, as we've said before, has been there, and we just need to adjust and alter and make sure that we're providing a fair scholarship to our student athletes. The other point, whether it's the O'Bannon case or whether it's the Northwestern unionization case, those are totally separate from the value of the scholarship. As far as the funding of it, whether it's at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, will there be an additional cost? Absolutely, there will be. And I think that they need to be prepared, just as the cost of travel and the cost of equipment, the cost of coaches' salaries are going up. This now is an additional cost that athletic directors and universities need to be able to absorb. There was a comment made earlier about the subsidies, and I think there's some misleading information in some of the materials where it says that University X gets $25,000 or costs $25,000 per player. That's really a misleading number there. Universities, 95%, as Joe said, fund and subsidize athletics just like they subsidize music and theater and all their other academic programs. And if it's important to the university, they're going to fund that. It just so happens that LSU was able to generate enough revenue to take that cost off of the university. UL Lafayette needs the university to subsidize, and they value it, and they think it's important.
Just if I could address what you just said, at the end of the day, what really is our mission? Our mission is to prepare young people for the rest of their lives. That's really what our mission is. Now, if you come and you're an athlete, and you are fortunate enough, you're one of the 1% or 0.5% that can go on and play professionally, well, then we have prepared you for the rest of your life to be a professional athlete. But for the 99.5% of the other athletes, our job is to educate them and prepare them for the rest of their lives. And getting a scholarship to go to school free, what a great advantage that is. What a great start on your life where you get out of school with no debt, you don't have any debt, and what did you do for 4 years? You got to play a sport that hopefully you love. That's a pretty good thing to do.
And I think what gets lost in a lot of the conversations and the attacks on the NCAA, because it's easy to attack the power institution, and people take a lot of shots at the NCAA, and the idea of there being exploitation of the student athletes and unfairness that the schools are making all this money and the student athletes are entitled to it. And there are a very small percentage of student athletes you can say, if this were a free market, not only would the school be paying them if they could, or to try to entice them to come to the school, but endorsement deals would be coming their way. And they'd be making a lot of money. But that's a tiny, tiny percentage. If you look at the significant majority of the student athletes, they are getting a really good deal for their scholarship. Because not only are they getting that scholarship, they're getting an opportunity they might not otherwise have to go to that institution to get that education. And that gets lost too often. And it's understandable to say the Johnny Manziels of the world are making a lot of money for their school and they should get a piece of it. And that's a tiny portion of the debate. The rest of it is, what about the 99.9% of the athletes who might get a worse deal if there were an open market? And if there were a true, fair negotiation, they might get less than their scholarship, and the rest of the money might shift all to the star player. And I don't think anyone wants that world.
Right. The backup center is getting right now the same as the star quarterback.
And one thing that I would like to say too, that I wish it was more information where we could educate the parents and the kids before they get to college, let them know what they're coming to college for, and that the parents need to support the coaches and the university when we discipline them to try and help them stay on the right track, because that is so key. The discipline that these young people gain is the key for them being successful in life.
But you talk about everybody gets the same thing now. If you started to mete out pay for positions, I think Gabrielle has a question about how that would work.
Correct. If you start to pay people when according to like what position they're in or to their popularity, would you pay, like a base salary, or would you suggest paying like in accordance to, how popular they are, or to how much of a star they are on your team?
Let me just start with this. Could you imagine if there was a free market and you could pay whatever you wanted, and the best quarterback in the country was being recruited, and coaches would go and say, "Well, I'll give you $100,000 a year. Well, I'll give you $200,000." Could you imagine what that would be like? First of all, second of all, I think it would. We talk about schools are already losing, athletic departments are losing money. If that ever happened, what you would see, and I hate to say this, but it's true, sports would be dropped. There would be men's sports and women's sports dropped to pay for those high-profile sports because you were paying the athletes. And if some of these rules go through, I think you're going to see at some institutions they're going to have to decide whether to drop sports or to give the added benefits to athletes.
We've already seen it, even without the added benefits, schools making decisions it's not worth it to foot the bill for their football program or things like that. Some have backtracked and brought the football team back, as we know, but it's expensive. It's expensive to fund college sports, and the question is if it becomes even more expensive because you have to pay the student athlete, will it lead to even fewer sports, as Joe said, and what will probably take the hit, frankly, with Title IX, you can't really cut the women's sports, so it'll be the non-revenue men's sports would be the ones who would likely be the first to go, unless the schools decided to reevaluate how they're spending their money and decided to shift more money from where it's being currently spent to the student athletes, which is a whole other conversation.
Well, and that is an interesting conversation, because when you look at the students, that's one thing, but look at the coaches. I think it's something like 37 states, a coach is the highest paid public employee in that state. Is that skewing things where a football coach is the highest paid employee in the state of Alabama or the state of Louisiana?
There's no question. It's an interesting phenomenon, but you know what it comes down to? It comes down to what is the price of winning, and people want to win, and they think by hiring the best coach and paying the most money that you have a chance of winning, and that's what it's all about. It's competitive nature, and people want to win, and that's not something new. It's been going on since sports have been in existence.
Yeah, just two observations on that. One is when a coach gets a raise or something, and they get $1 million raise, they get signed away. You notice that people don't say, well, then how are we going to be able to fund our other sports if we're paying $1 million more for that coach? Right? The conversation only happens with student athletes for a variety of reasons. And so people say, well, why doesn't the NCAA put a limit on how much the coaches make? Wouldn't that be a good way to do it? Just cap how much they make. And people say, the NCAA just won't do it because they only want to screw the student athletes, not the coaches. Well, the NCAA tried to put a limit on how much coaches could make, and that got struck down as illegal. So it's not as if the NCAA hasn't tried to find some cost certainty or sanity with coaching salaries, but it's illegal. And I think it's going to be up to whether it's the courts or potentially Congress. I know people roll their eyes when I say Congress might need to get involved to fix anything, but to find a way to fix what might be happening in college sports or the road we might be going down if these lawsuits are successful. We've only talked about O'Bannon, but Karl mentioned the other antitrust lawsuits in the unionization effort that are out there. The other antitrust lawsuits that are still pending could truly blow up the system because there are 4 or 5 lawsuits that are out there right now facing the NCAA saying that the restriction on how much the student athletes get from their schools, forget about cost of attendance versus grant and aid, that putting a cap at all is illegal. And that schools can't put any cap on it and they have to pay whatever they want, or they should be allowed to pay whatever they want. If that's the case, then we get closer to the free market system, and then who knows what the world will look like. And then it may be that Congress decides to step in and say, we can't live in this world with college sports.
Don, you had
Well, in Division I football, they have the bowl system, and now they'll have the playoff system. In all other NCAA Division I sports, including baseball, Roger, there's a tournament. Everybody competes, all 280 or whatever number we have in Division I to compete against in the same competition. Karl, I'll ask you specifically. You may have some schools that meet the demand for football, or they may choose their sport to compete with the extra benefits. But in many of the other sports, they're going to be at a disadvantage competing for that one single national championship. How do they address that?
Well, the economic gap has always been much larger than the competitive gap. And there's example after example of teams from lesser resource universities, whether it's Butler University in the Final Four, whether it's Rice winning a World Series, Fresno State winning a World Series, on the softball side. We have multiple champions below football. And then on the football side, there's always that one Boise State, or there's that one TCU that rises to the top despite the economic gap.
Or Tulane.
Absolutely. And so we've always seen that, Don, and I don't see the competitive piece changing here. One question or one follow up on the coaches' salaries, the disparity that we've seen over the last 20 years. Yes, there have been the $1 million coaches, and many of them in both football and basketball specifically. But everyone else in this enterprise, from college presidents and chancellors to athletic directors to commissioners to women's basketball coaches to women's softball coaches, their salaries have escalated as the enterprise has grown. And the only group that hasn't had an increase have been the student athletes. And that's what this is all about right now, is trying to reverse what we've neglected over the last 25 years.
Catherine, you...
I actually had a question about what he was just saying.
Go for it.
You said, the only demographic that hasn't been compensated in that situation is the student athletes. But these student athletes that are getting these full ride scholarships, is that not considered, a payment at all? I mean, I know it's going directly toward their room and board and classes and books and all that, but is that not considered a form of almost subsidization, I guess, for their education? I mean, I feel like they're not getting completely.
No, they have been compensated, and the student athletes have a general pretty, as Joe said, a pretty good life. And unfortunately, we haven't told the story very well. And we've let some high-profile student athletes take the stage and take the podium and talk about how they have been exploited or how they have not been provided, how they don't have enough money to go out for pizza or to, for a date. And that just is not an accurate assessment of what's going on college campuses. And the amount of additional NCAA funding that has gone to those that qualify for financial aid is enormous. The amount of additional money over and above the scholarship over the last 10 years. There are funds on every college campus that will allow a student athlete to return home for a family emergency, that will allow a student athlete to go and buy a suit to go to graduation or do whatever. And those stories are not told. And we've done a horrible job of that. And that's what we really need to focus on in the future is, one, change the model, but two, do a better job of explaining the model.
And at Southern, we call it the Needy Student Fund, that every kid that is eligible gets that money. So they are getting money, whether they get a partial scholarship or not. Once they fill out the paperwork correctly, they can get that money. And that's the key word, fill it out correctly.
Is that for student athletes and just students, both, who have access to that?
Student athlete, I don't know about the regular student.
It's just athletes, student athletes.
And that money comes from the very, very successful NCAA basketball tournament.
Yep.
That when the revenue distribution model was formed 15 years ago, when you first heard about that $1 billion NCAA basketball tournament television, there were several initiatives created to get money in place to provide for, as Coach said, the needy student athlete. So we've been trying to do a a job of providing rather than paying.
Well, and also along those lines, you know, you hear stories about athletes saying that they don't, if they hurt their knee, they don't have their medical bills paid for. I don't know what schools those are. I mean, I don't know schools that I know of. At our school, if you get hurt, we're going to pay all your bills. You know, you hear about 4-year scholarships and 1-year scholarships. Well, at our school, you don't lose your scholarship unless you do something really bad. And if you do something, you know, you flunk out of school or you do something really bad, you lose your scholarship. If you don't, you're going to keep your scholarship. If you go to practice and do what you're supposed to do, keep your nose clean, you're going to keep your scholarship. So I don't know where these stories come from, but there's a lot of rumors out there.
I think part of that is the question of how much, who's looking out for the students, who's looking out for the athletes, who's looking out for the student athletes. And I think that intrinsic in Catherine's question is, don't they already get special treatment? I mean, you have an academic center for student athletes on the LSU campus.
Totally.
If Catherine wanted to go there and study, could she go there and study as just a regular student in the Honors College?
She could go there during the day. In the evening, it's only for athletes. But you're right. Our athletes get tutored. We have learning specialists. We have all sorts of any problem that our athletes have. We have services to help them with. So.
And those aren't just the football and
it's
men's
all
women's
of
basketball. And that's something else that goes unreported is that, you know, the academic support system for all student athletes, regardless of the sport.
Cheryl, you have
Yes. Suppose we could get this true story out there. Would that stop the movement that's currently afloat?
I think it would help. I think it would help a little. You know, in my opinion, this is my opinion alone, what's happened over the years is that you've seen television contracts get so big, you've seen coaches' salaries get large, and everyone thinks that there's so much money out there. And in reality, when you have 20 or 24 sports and you have to fund all those sports, at LSU we really have 2 sports that really make money, that generate money, that pay for all the other sports. And those are football and baseball at our school. Baseball is a moneymaker at our school, and they have to pay for all the other sports. And so at the end of the day, there's really not a lot left over. But the problem is everyone reads those television contracts and those coaches' contracts, and they say, wow, there's millions of dollars out there for everybody to spend. And in reality, that's not the truth. That's not what reality is.
And to get the word out could be a little more difficult because it could send a message if the institution get out front to do that, then they're saying that they're trying to conceal something. You're not in a win-win situation or no-win situation if you try to do it. So you're better addressing it as it comes up.
Well, Professor Feldman talked a little bit about how there's this other stuff that's out there that could upset the apple cart. One of the things that I'm aware of is the concussion case. The NFL had put up $750-some million to take care of concussions, and that's not the end of it. They're still liable for damages. The NCAA has a lawsuit pending on the concussion situation. What happens if suddenly the NCAA and the schools start having to worry about concussions that student athletes who were there 15 years ago may have be able to trace back to Death Valley? What happens, Joe?
It could be a real serious problem. It could be a very serious problem. I know recently schools have taken tremendous measures to make sure that we have protocol in place to monitor concussions. And, you know, in the old days, a coach might have decided if you can play. Now we make sure a doctor's deciding if you can play or not. And there's a huge difference in the protocol. But you're right, going back 10, 20, 30 years, I have to defer to my lawyer friend over here on that one because it could change the whole scope of what's going on.
Lawyer friend?
Well, I mean, the NCAA already reached a settlement with the class of plaintiffs in this case, and it put aside money for testing and evaluation. It's not actually for money damages, and if it shows that these athletes are former student athletes, and it's not just football we're talking about. There's some non-football players who are bringing these suits as well, because football is not the only contact sport out there. That whether it's the schools or the NCAA itself might be on the hook for some damages, and I think we're just starting to see, and there are no accusations leveled against the NCAA or the individual institutions like there are against the NFL for covering up information about the dangers of head trauma. So the NCAA doesn't have to worry about all of that. But I think there's going to be a change. We're already seeing changes in protocols with dealing with concussions and return to play, not only at the college level, but the high school level and at the youth level, and I think that's where it's a bigger issue.
So it's all a lot of money. Are we reaching a saturation point where that athletics, college athletics just can't generate anymore. And just real quick, because we're running out of time, each one of you all hit that one. We're hitting the saturation point. You got 5 seconds each.
TV networks continue to have a very, very large interest in college sports, and they will continue to pay.
When you get right down to it, the only reality TV is athletics. You don't know what's going to happen until you watch the game. So I don't think we've seen the end of it yet.
We live in a society that really love to see aggressive sports. And I mean, let's face it, they want to see college football and pro football. So you are going to see it getting a little more aggressive as we go forward.
Not only is it the only reality, the ultimate reality of television, it's the only television program that exists where as soon as the program ends, it loses all of its value. And advertisers love that because you have to watch it live. You can't DVR and watch it the next day because it's lost total value. So you got to sit there, watch it live, go through all the commercials. That's where the advertisers make their money. They know they have the eyeballs. As long as there's one more network than there is college football to show, there's going to be a lot of money in college sports.
Well, we've run out of time for our question and answer segment. We'd like to thank our panelists, Commissioner Benson, Mr. Alleva, Coach Cador, Professor Feldman, for their insights on this month's topic. When we come back, we'll have a few closing comments. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of Louisiana Public Square. We encourage you to visit our website at lpb.org/publicsquare. While you're there, take this month's survey, view extended interview clips, and comment on tonight's show. We'd love to hear from you like we did from viewers following last month's program, Down the Road, Our Transportation Future. Kathy writes, as I understand the presentation about transportation funding, all the money paid by taxpayers to fund transportation projects is not used for that purpose. Why then would any sane taxpayer vote more taxes? Bob writes, for 50-plus years, there's been a lot of talk about a loop around Baton Rouge, and nothing but studies have been done. It's time someone got something done. And Jack writes, what a way to present the information. Highly professional. Hats off. Well, thanks to everyone for their comments. In November, Louisiana voters will be heading to the polls to decide who will represent them in Washington, D.C. Join us in October as Louisiana Public Square explores where those members should be focusing their energies on Louisiana's congressional priorities. Thanks for watching, and good night.
For a copy of this program, call 1-800-973-7246 or go online to www.lpb.org.
Support for this program is provided by the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting and from viewers like you.